We have breaking news out of the United States Supreme Court dealing with the First Amendment's right to free speech. The U.S. Supreme Court has decided to expedite the question of whether Congress's law that was enacted in April that effectively bans the Chinese government's ownership of the application of TikTok violates the First Amendment. I think this is a good teaching tool for we in the Second Amendment to understand what's going on here. I don't think we have to get that geeky in this case, but I want you to understand the basics of this fight over TikTok and why the Supreme Court decided to take this case and hear oral argument in the month of January over TikTok and whether or not what government did here violates the First Amendment right to free speech. Stay tuned. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of the Georgetown Journal of Law and Public Policy article entitled Dangerous But Not Unusual, Mistakes Commonly Made by Lower Courts in the Post-Bruin Litigation World. Check out a free link to it down below. If you like scholarship in the Second Amendment, you definitely want to read this. I'm sure this will be cited by courts and to courts going forward, into the years. Okay, folks, now, I want to talk about the First Amendment. There's a lot of lessons here speaking to the Second Amendment. This is in the news, and because this is in the news, dealing with our Bill of Rights, dealing with the U.S. Supreme Court, I want to make sure that you remain the smartest people in the room. And sometimes, as you know, from the Four Boxes Diner, which speaks to the four boxes of American liberty, the cartridge box, which means the guns, the jury box, which means the rule of law, the soap box, which is the right to free speech, and of course, guess what is the other fourth box? You tell me, the ballot box, the right to vote. Those are the four boxes of American liberty. And of course, one of those four boxes, in addition to the box involving cartridges and guns, is the soap box, which speaks to the right to free speech. And that's why I want to talk today about the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to expedite this case brought by TikTok, a California-based corporation that is basically owned by the Chinese government, challenging a federal law that went into effect in April, or actually, technically speaking, it was signed in the spring, and I think goes into effect in January, officially in effect. Now, this law, which basically deals with foreign, and this is important to understand this. This law was intended to deal with foreign governments, foreign powers, controlling applications that could be abused in various ways to the detriment of American citizens. Now, the argument here is that TikTok is ultimately owned by the Chinese Communist Party, which runs the government of China, the country of China, which is a foreign adversary of ours, if not foreign enemies. So even though they own this California-based corporation, the argument by Congress was that this is a no-can-do. If we were in the middle of World War II, let's say, and Tokyo Rose was, doing the propaganda on behalf of the Imperial Japanese forces, which they were doing, it was multiple women that played the role of Tokyo Rose, propagandizing and, speaking to American troops in English that were overseas in Asia, we would have no obligation, obviously, to allow Tokyo Rose and the Japanese government to be able to propagandize American citizens on our soil during World War II. So the argument is here, same idea. The American government, neither the American government nor the United States Constitution requires that foreign adversaries to the United States have some sort of a legal right to propagandize American citizens using various apps such as TikTok to speak to American citizens, including American children, or to denigrate them, or to degrade them, or to provide filth in forms of various nasty videos and the like. These are the arguments that have been brought against TikTok. Now, there's another component here, and then we're going to break down the legalese in a moment. But in addition to the concern about a foreign adversary engaging in propaganda of the American population in various ways, which if you support the Second Amendment, that's a very big deal, by the way. Because does anybody doubt that if the Chinese government could, using TikTok and other applications and other means of communications, if they could talk the American public into disarming in violation of the Second Amendment, right? If they could somehow persuade all Americans that guns were dangerous, guns were bad, guns were terrible, the Second Amendment needs to go away, and that Americans should all give up their guns, does anybody doubt for 1 second that the communist Chinese in running China would want a disarmed American public, a disarmed and group of Americans unfamiliar with firearms, unfamiliar with weaponry, unfamiliar with technology, unfamiliar with anything associated with defense applications? Of course. So there's no doubt that if you're concerned about our foreign adversaries engaging in propaganda to the detriment of our country, of our children, of our Constitution, of our Bill of Rights, and yes, indeed, of our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, and you should be paying attention to this TikTok case. Now, beyond the fact there's concern about propaganda of having a foreign adversary control TikTok, there's another component here, and that is information gathering or intelligence gathering. So in addition to worrying about propaganda against America's interest, there's also the concern that the Chinese government is able to suck up all of this data, intelligence, concerning a whole host of American citizens, including children. So that is a separate and independent concern, that TikTok is not just being used to degrade Americans and to propagandize Americans in a negative way against our American interests and in favor of the Chinese communists. It's also serving as a conduit whereby the Chinese are able to acquire information and data about the United States and about our citizens and about our children, to then in turn use that information as a weapon against the United States and our American interests. So that was the concern that prompted Congress to enact this law entitled Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act. Now, what just happened is this was passed in the spring. It's been litigated. It was upheld in a 3-0 decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. TikTok sought cert from the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court just granted cert, which means they want to hear the case on the merits, and they've scheduled oral argument, I believe, on January 19th of 2025. Now, before we go a step further, I want to let you all know, so you can breathe a sigh of relief, nothing about what I'm going to say, nothing about this expedited cert grant, nothing about this oral argument is going to affect the good, the bad, the ugly, or the odds, or statistics, or anything associated with what the Supreme Court's going to do this term with our Second Amendment rights, including with those cases of, as you know, Snope versus Brown out of Maryland, Ocean State Tactical out of Rhode Island, and of course, the Gray versus Jennings case out of Delaware. Those 3 cases can still all be heard. This TikTok case does not get in the way of those Second Amendment cases at all, so do not fear that. And again, as you know, in order to make sure our right to keep and bear arms is protected, we also want to be able to communicate about our right to keep and bear arms using our First Amendment rights. So the First Amendment right to free speech, to talk about the Second Amendment, and our Second Amendment rights to protect the First Amendment work together hand in hand, which is why they're all part of the original 10 amendments constituting the Bill of Rights. That's how important they were, that the founders thought they should be in the Bill of Rights. So with that said, the question presented in this case involving TikTok is really quite simple. Here is the question presented. Whether the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, as applied to petitioners, which is TikTok, violates the First Amendment. Whether the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Application Act violates the First Amendment. If you notice the question presented, it says as applied to the petitioners. So this is an as applied challenge, not a facial challenge. TikTok is only caring about itself. They're not trying to say this law is unconstitutional in all of its examples, all of its extrapolations, all of its applications. They're just saying that as applied to we, TikTok, a California-based corporation here in the United States, it's unconstitutional under the First Amendment. So that gives rise as to how does this get analyzed. And this is an important thing because we want to talk about how the First Amendment jurisprudence is related to Second Amendment jurisprudence, but different and in many respects worse than, from a freedom point of view, Second Amendment jurisprudence. So as you know from the Second Amendment, we're going to talk about briefly the Second Amendment, then we're going to compare it to the First Amendment, and then you'll see the difference and why we're so much better off in the Second Amendment context. Under the Second Amendment, as you know, because of Heller and Bruin, you start with the text of the Second Amendment as defined by the Supreme Court in the Heller case. If a modern-day gun control law is implicated by the text of the Second Amendment, that means that law is presumptively unconstitutional, and the burden shifts to the government to show there's a long-standing historical tradition of firearms regulation going back to the founding that justifies the modern-day gun control law. And that's the end of it. Government wins or government loses. Text first, historical tradition analysis second. Now, let's compare that to the First Amendment analysis, which we're about to apply to this case dealing with TikTok's alleged First Amendment rights to run their platform and to allow users of TikTok to use that to express the First Amendment rights. In the First Amendment context, it sounds very similar to begin with. You start with the text of the First Amendment, which has certain meanings. That's fine. But then, remember, the First Amendment is much more developed. It has been litigated a lot more over the last many, many decades than the Second Amendment, so it's been fleshed out considerably. But then the Supreme Court has looked for historical exceptions. Does this sound familiar? It should. So you have the right to free speech, but that doesn't mean you have the right to say anything you want, anytime you want, anything like that. You know, the usual sort of left-wing kind of comments they like to use to make excuses for taking away our rights. And there are a bunch of historical exceptions to the right to free speech. Just to give you a list of some basic ones, obscenity, which is a distinction from pornography, but obscenity does not receive any First Amendment protection. Inciting people to engage in violence, right there, trying to get someone to engage in violence is not protected by the First Amendment. Making violent threats in someone's face is not protected by the First Amendment. You know, speech associated with engaging in criminal conduct, like fraud, for example, if I lie to you to steal your money, that's not protected by the First Amendment, even though that's speech. Defamation, if I defame you, again, I don't have a First Amendment defense to say, hey, you know, you're a blah, 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 and that's defamatory. And I can't say I have a First Amendment right to defame you. I don't have a First Amendment right to defame you, even at the time of the founding or today. Fighting words that start at, say, let's get into a fight right now, that's not allowed in things like counterfeiting. You can't, say, I want to freely express my views by printing up counterfeit money. That's an exception to the text of the First Amendment. So here's the thing. You got the meaning of the First Amendment, and then you look at the history, and there's exceptions to that. Sounds a lot like Second Amendment jurisprudence. But here is where it gets much, much worse for our freedoms in the First Amendment context than in the Second Amendment context. And that's because in the First Amendment context, even if you can show that you've engaged in the right to free speech that does not fall within one of those exceptions, you can still lose your right to free speech. Why is that? Because the government gets another bite at the apple to win. Because the government, through liberal judicial activism in the last 5 decades, has embraced something known as tiers of scrutiny. Tiers of scrutiny. And what is tiers of scrutiny? Let me be very clear. Tiers of scrutiny is a euphemism. It is a political propaganda phrase that simply means that black-robed mystics, black-robed judges, get to weigh the good and the bad of your free speech against the good and the bad of what government wants, the reasons why government wants to oppress your speech or suppress or censor your speech. And the judges get to decide through tiers of scrutiny, which again is really just saying, well, yeah, we know this violates your First Amendment rights, but the government has a really, really, really important good reason for doing it, and therefore we're going to allow it to occur. Now, this tiers of scrutiny step, which is really just giving the government another chance to win and justify, restricting our First Amendment rights, this next step does not exist, thank God, in the context of the Second Amendment. If the text implicates a modern gun control law and there's no historical tradition that justifies the modern gun control law, freedom wins, the Second Amendment wins, period, full stop. But in the First Amendment context, again, you then take this next step into tiers of scrutiny. Now, that's important to understand here, because what happened in this case of TikTok is the lower courts, and what the Supreme Court's going to do here is they are almost certainly going to engage in some sort of tiers of scrutiny. Now, what's going to happen here, and why there's a very good chance I think TikTok is going to lose this case, is because the federal law does not actually say that TikTok is censored and can no longer speak in America. What the law says is that as long as TikTok is controlled by, owned and controlled by a foreign adversary in the form of the Chinese Communist government, under those circumstances, the tiers of scrutiny, strict scrutiny standards are satisfied because, again, we don't want Tokyo Rose or some foreign power to propagandize our citizenry to the detriment of our national interest, because they're foreigners overseas piping information to hurt our country and concerns issues associated with national security. And again, the theft of private information and personal information from American citizens to be used by foreign adversaries and foreign enemies against the United States. So that's why the lower court in a 3-0 decision said this law is constitutional, because when you weigh the concern of the federal government to shut down this foreign influence against any alleged free speech rights, it's pretty clear that the government has a compelling state interest that justifies this law. And of course, beyond the tiers of scrutiny itself, just at first principles, one wonders, does the Chinese government even have First Amendment rights here in the United States when they're not even in the United States, right? That's the thing. It's not like we have someone from China that's here on a student visa speaking on a college campus on some topic. There may be First Amendment rights in what I just described there. But if you're the Chinese government in Beijing using a computer app to pipe in propaganda and information that's undesirable to America into our country, it's unlikely that the Supreme Court's going to find that foreign powers have First Amendment rights to engage in sort of activities and speech that arguably violates or arguably undercuts American national interests as viewed by, or at least as understood by our elected officials, both our Congress and our president, which in this case it was bipartisan. There was Republicans, Democrats, and Joe Biden all signed off on this law that is now being litigated against TikTok, which ultimately is owned by the Chinese Communist government. All right, so that's what you need to understand about this TikTok case, why it implicates the First Amendment and the real arguments. On the one argument, you have TikTok saying that these are First Amendment rights of the company and First Amendment rights of our users. And on the other side, you have the argument that says, well, no, we're not stopping you from speaking because all the law requires, and this is the key, all the law requires is that if TikTok wants to remain in business, they just have to make sure that the Chinese government divests its interest and ownership in TikTok itself. So, for example, if I were to own TikTok, or if you were to own TikTok, there'd be no issues. The law would not apply. This law only applies to TikTok today because of the ownership and control of the Chinese government over the company. If you did not have that Chinese control and it was, again, just owned by ordinary folks in the normal course, but not a foreign adversary, none of this would be a problem. This would all be protected by the First Amendment. But where the arguable exception to a First Amendment argument is that this is really a platform engaging in anti-American activity by a foreign adversary or a foreign enemy against American interest, both in terms of propaganda and in terms of information and intelligence gathering from the American citizens. And from a Second Amendment perspective, it's very little doubt in my mind that the Chinese government using TikTok would have every incentive to disarm Americans, to persuade Americans to disarm ourselves through gun control laws so we're not prepared to fight a foreign adversary if one tried to invade us. Because as you know, from the famous Supreme Court justice of Amistad fame in the movie Steven Spielberg did on Amistad, the slave ship, Supreme Court Joseph Story explained in 1833 or so that the right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic, since it offers a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers, and will generally, even if these are successful in the first instance, enable the people to resist and triumph over them. So again, with that kind of historical tradition in favor of armed citizens here in the United States, which makes the United States largely impossible to invade and conquer long term, if you're the Chinese government and you are interested in maybe invading the United States at some point down the road, getting Americans to voluntarily disarm by being persuaded by TikTok videos is not a bad strategy. As to whether or not they're going to do that, whether or not they're doing it, that's a separate question. It's not up for me to decide. That's up for the courts and up for the U.S. government, and of course the fight against the TikTok itself. And we'll see what the Supreme Court says about all this, because all this information that we've just talked about is certainly going to be discussed in court. And as to what happens, we'll find out by June. But certainly this oral argument on June 19th will be most interesting. And I hope I gave you enough background so when you read in the papers about what's going on, this allows you to really be the smartest person in the room. So there you have it, folks. Hope you enjoyed today's video. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. We're trying to get to 200,000 subscribers and catch up with some other Second Amendment channels. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends. Don't forget to follow me on X at 4Boxes Diner. And I look forward to talking to all of you again very, very soon, I hope, here at the 4Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.